Main event of the day was the game between world champion Gukesh Demiraj representing India and Grandmaster from Uzbekistan Nadirbek Abdusadorov, who is sixth highest ranked player in the world and after 5 games was leading the tournament with 4 points out of 5. Nadirbek played white and started the game with the move e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5. That's a standard opening, Jacobiana opening or Italian defense, as some people call it. A4, kind of unusual move. The most standard continuations in these positions are C3, with the idea of getting the pawn on the center, and D4. Also, a very popular move is D3, which is a slow way to play this opening. And castle is another way. But A4 is not very popular continuation. And black plays knight f6, developing the knight on f6. White plays d3, opening the diagonal for the black squared bishop. d6, opening the diagonal for the white squared bishop. And a5. So obviously when you play a4, it's logically that you want to move the pawn forward till it's allowed to move. And after a5, bishop goes to b4 with a check. Now you cannot play standard defending move c3 or knight c3 because the pawn on a5 is under attack by 2 pieces. So white plays bishop d2, which is the only way to protect this pawn. Exchange the bishops on d2, taking with the knight. Kind of important because you would you might think that queen d2 is also possible, then knight c3 and putting the knight eventually on d5, but this is another way to treat this position. And the knight goes to d2, and then the idea is to gradually move it to a nice square on f5. So that's basic idea of the move knight d2. Castle. White castles as well. Knight goes to e7. That's a standard maneuver for black in this particular opening, and in some other openings when the knight goes from b8 to c6 to e7 to g6 and then to f4. c3, preparing the move d4. Knight g6, which is the continuation of the maneuvering of the knight to f4. Rook e1, h6, prophylactical move, just in case, so the king has an escape on h7. d4, gaining the center. Knight goes to h7. And the reason, the idea of this move is that the knight wants to go to g5 and create some activity on the king side for the black. White goes rook e3, sorry, and the rook will eventually would like to go to g file or h file to attack the black king. Knight g5, exchange on g5, queen goes to g5, and black's position looks pretty fine with the very active queen on g5 and some ideas of knight going to a4 and potentially checkmating on g2. g3, kind of for the future not allowing the knights jumps on f4 or h4. Right now you can go knight h4, knight f4 or knight h4 because there is a pin and you cannot take the knight, but it doesn't really do anything for the black's position, so therefore black just goes bishop g4, activating another piece and attacking the white queen, sorry. h4, counterattacking. So instead of defending your own queen, white actually plays aggressive and with the move h4 attacking the queen on g5. And the queen goes away to h5. Now the queen is definitely under attack. It has to move. Goes to b3. Nice square for the queen because now there is a pressure on the pawn f7. Also, there is an attack on the pawn b7. Black protects the pawn with the move rook b8, and knight goes to f1. The purpose of this move is that the knight wants to go to h2 and to attack the bishop on g4. Bishop on g4 is kind of annoying for white position. It's a really strong piece for the black, and white wants to get rid of it. Knight e7, knight h2. Now, that's a very strong bishop on g4, not a very strong knight on h2. So obviously the exchange on g4 would be in white's favor. So black moves away. Bishop goes to d7. Bishop e2, attacking the queen. Queen goes to g6. Exchange the pawns on e5, and rook goes to the open file d file, and at the same time attacking the bishop on d7. Bishop moves away to e6. Queen is under attack, so the queen goes to b5. Nice square again for the white queen, and attacking the pawn on e5 that has to be defended. And according to the engines, the best way to defend the pawn was f6, which looks very logical. Instead, Gukesh played the move knight c6, and the move knight c6 actually is not the best, because after h5, I'm sorry, the move is not the best because immediately it allows a6. It allows a6, and the pawn moves forward, and now you cannot take the pawn because the knight is not protected. So therefore, after a6, black has to play defense, and the bishop goes to c8, defending the pawn on b7. h5 attacking the queen, queen goes to f6, rook f3 attacking the queen again, queen moves away, bishop c4 attacking the queen for the third time in a row. White's position is really good. All pieces except for this knight are very active, and instead black's position is very passive, with the rook on b8, rook on f8, rook and bishop on c8. All three pieces are not really in the game. So in a way, white plays with extra pieces right now on the board, because they have so many more active pieces attacking black's position. Queen goes away to e7, queen a4, and another move back, knight d8. Obviously, Gukesh is a world champion, and he knows how to defend these positions, but it doesn't look really pretty, right? The knight on d8, the bishop on c8, but everything is defended. White takes the pawn, and black takes with the bishop, and rook goes to e3 because you have to protect a very important pawn on e4 because it was attacked by the bishop. Bishop c6 attacking the queen. Now it's important that you cannot take the pawn on a7, because after rook a8, it turns out that the queen has no moves. It's under attack, and it has no moves, so white will lose the queen. Therefore, the queen moves away to a2, again putting some pressure on the pawn on f7, although it's right now protected by 4 black pieces, but still. Knight b7, knight is getting to a more active position, possibly d6, maybe c5. b4, aggressive move on the queen side of the board. Knight goes to d6. Now you cannot really exchange this great bishop for this pretty passive knight. So bishop goes to d5, exchanging the bishops on d5. Rook takes d5, queen e6. Queen e6, pinning the rook to the queen. So you cannot, let's say, go rook c5 in this position, attacking the pawn, because the queen would be lost. So in this position, white goes to e2 with the rook, c6, The rook is under attack, and now the rook goes to a5. Again, protecting the queen, attacking the pawn on a5, on a7, exchange of the queens. Now, you couldn't take it with the rook from e2 because this pawn on e4 is then becomes loose. So, queen takes a2, rook takes a2, rook c8. Rook c8 is a smart move. Black do not care about the pawn on a7. They want to create counter chances on the c and b files. Therefore, white don't even take the pawn on a7, but they continue to attack with another piece. Now, finally, white's knight is in the game, goes to g4, attacking the pawn on e5, and instead of protecting the pawn on e5 with the move f6, let's say, black immediately goes into counterattack, breaking the pawn structure of white with the move c5. And in this position already becoming equal, although 2-3 moves ago, white was a lot better. So after c5, b takes c5, rook takes c5, not only the rook became very active, but it also protects the pawn on e5, attacks the pawn on c3, and black's problems are behind them. Rook takes c7, rook takes c3, and a rook d7 attacking the knight. The knight has to go away, and the white takes the pawn on e5. So white has an extra pawn. It's not, it's the most that they could get from a great position they had about 5 moves ago. But this is something, it's a pawn. Um, Position is still very much drawish. It's very difficult to win this for white. Black plays knight f6 attacking the rook and not being afraid that the pawn on f7 is under attack. Because the plan was, I'll show you the plan. If rook takes f7, then rook e8 attacking the knight. And what happens is that you cannot protect both the knight and the rook. At the same time, if the knight goes away, then the king will take the rook. And if you play something like a4, then the pawn on, the pawn on g3 is under attack, the pawn on h5 is under attack. So black has no problem in this position. Actually, they have a better game here. So after knight f6, white doesn't take on f7, they go rook e7 first. Black again goes aggressively with the rook to b4, attacking the pawn on e4. White plays g4, because the pawn on h5 was under attack as well, so out of those two pawns, white decided that they would like to keep the pawn on h5. Rook c5. Now, if rook takes on e4 here, then this position is actually lost for black, because after rook takes e4, knight takes e4, there is a check on e8. Kings go to h7, the only move, and knight f7. And what happens is there is a checkmate coming on h8, and the knight on e4 is under attack, so black loses. Black loses. They have to go g6 in order to at least defend themselves from checkmate, but then they lose a piece on e4. So therefore, in this position, black plays rook c5, f3, protecting the pawn chain, king f8. Interesting move. I mean, makes sense, because the idea was after rook f7, and that was actually played in the game, kings go to e8, and the same kind of idea that we noticed several moves ago. The knight and the rook are under attack. So really very difficult to protect those two pieces. But here, white finds the move knight d3. I'm saying he finds the move knight d3, but I'm sure that when Noderberg took the pawn on f7, he knew this continuation and he already calculated ahead of time that he has the move knight d3, attacking both rooks. Now rook b1 check, and that's probably what Gukesh was playing for, because after rook b1 check, kings has to move away to g2. Rook goes to c3, and again the same theme. The knight and the rook are still under attack, both of them. So the knight goes to e5, protecting the rook. Another rook is attacking the knight. Again, knight and rook under attack. So black is putting pressure on white pieces. And here, great move by Grandmaster from Uzbekistan. Rook takes g7. He sacrifices. He sacrifices the knight on e5. And very unusual endgame here. Two rooks against two rooks and four pawns against one pawn and a knight. So we have 3 pawns against the knight, which considered equal, but because all these pawns are so well connected, they're all together, this position is actually winning for white. So move rook g7 was winning, and Nozdrberg found it. But let's see what happens next. Rook a2, checkmate is on the way. Black has to go king f8, attacking the rook. So now if you go rook a8, then the king just will take the rook. Rook g6, another simple move, attacking both the knight and the pawn. And black here plays a very smart move, knight takes e4, sacrificing the knight. And what happens is that grandmasters just know that if you go to a rook endgame, even without a pawn, being on the same flank, on the same king side, that's actually a theoretical draw. So Gukesh knew this, Nozdrberg knew this as well. So he didn't take the knight on e4 and played rook e2, pinning the knight to the rook. Rook g5, another smart maneuver to try to exchange the pieces. Rook take h6, knight c5. And now we have 3 connected pawns against one knight. Winning position for white, but again, not very easy. Rook c6, knight a4, defending the rook on c3, attacking the knight again. Knight goes back to c5, check from a8, king f7, another check, king f6. And here is the critical mistake of the game. Rook e8 turned out to be a mistake. So this position is still more or less winning for white. And the best move in this position was h6, with very complicated variations. So even a grandmaster of this caliber, Nazarbek Abdusadurov, with 19 minutes to go on the clock, couldn't figure out this position. I cannot blame him for this. The position is very, very complicated. And rook e8 turned out to be a mistake. After rook e8, knight went to e6, and after knight went to e6, it turned out that knight controls the whole position here. It controls all the necessary squares. Now white plays h6, but it's too late already. Rook goes to e5 with a tactical shot on the way. Knight f4 check, and rook would be under attack. So rook a6, pinning the knight to the king. So now there is no knight f4. Rook c2 check, king f1, and after a number of checks, both opponents decided that this is an even endgame, and computer agrees with them. And the game ended in a draw. Very interesting game. A lot of very subtle, nice moves, and both players are on top of the standings in this tournament. Both players are on top of their game, and this particular game showed it that they are really the favorites to win this tournament. One more game I want to show you today is the game between two Russian grandmasters who represent different countries right now. Alexei Sarana representing Serbia and Vladimir Fedoseev representing Slovenia. White plays d4, d5, c4, e6, and knight c3. That's a queen's gambit declined. Queen's gambit, the pawn on c4 was not taking, so that's why it's declined. Bishop goes to e7, regular theoretical moves, and exchange variation. White takes the pawn on d5, he takes the pawn on d5. Normally, those type of openings are kind of drawish. To play for a win, White normally would like to keep pressure in the center and not to exchange the pawns. But Sarana decided to do that, and let's see what happens next. The bishop goes to f4, which is a great diagonal for the bishop. c6, standard move. One more time defending the pawn on d5. Queen c2. That's an important move because the white square bishop would like to go to f5. That would be the best diagonal for him. But the queen c2 protects the square of f5. Knight f6, developing the knight. h3, just so in the future there are no moves like knight g4 or something like that. And also after the castle, the king would be able to escape on h2. So that's like prophylactic move for the future. Queen a5, not a very popular move in this position at all. Obviously not a mistake, but that's something that's not played in this position very often. White plays e3 and would like to develop a bishop to put the bishop into the game. Knight goes to e4. Now the knight is pinned, so knight e4 is a good square for the knight and it cannot be taken, so that knight becomes a nuisance for white. Bishop d3, immediately attacking that knight. Knight a6, with the idea to move the knight to b4. So that's actually a threat. Now, normal move a3 to protect from knight b4 doesn't work in this case because still knight b4 will follow. You cannot take the knight because you will lose the rook. So therefore, in this position, to defend from knight b4, white plays queen a4. An interesting move. Now you cannot take the knight with the knight because the queen is under attack, and then if you take the queen on a4, then the knight from c3 protects it. Black moves away to b6, queen goes to b3 for white. In this particular position, it's not advisable to take the queen on b3 because after those exchanges, the rook, the white rook on a file becomes very strong. Despite the double pawns, which is a weakness in white's position, those files are very strong for white rooks. So white has a very small but long-lasting advantage in those type of positions. Therefore, black goes bishop f5. The knight on e4 was really strong, so white decided to get rid of it. And we get a position where black has two bishops, and actually a little advantage because of that. Position is kind of open. Two bishops are just create some advantage for black in this position. White goes knight e2 with the idea to move the knight on g3. Knight b4. So the threat is to go knight d3 with the check, and the white will not be able to castle after the check. So they immediately do that, castle. Here, logically, probably would be still to put the knight on d3, creating pressure on the pawn on b2, creating pressure on the bishop on g4, on f4, I'm sorry. But black played castle, and after queen d1, move the bishop to g6, bishop g3. Now those moves look strange, but in reality, they're just preparing, both sides are preparing for um, moving pawns on file f, and also for white, the square on f4 becoming very important, and it's better to put the knight there instead of a bishop. So in those cases, those moves make sense, and immediately f5. That's pretty much why the move bishop g6 was made. And knight goes to f4. Great square for knight. Um, Black didn't want to exchange the pieces on g6. So they move away to f7. a3, attacking the knight. Knight goes back to a6. And b4. Very aggressive move on the queen side, gaining space and putting some pressure on black position. And black goes back to d8, possibly starting to think of some attack on the king side. d5. Great move. Immediately gaining space in the center. It's not advisable to take the pawn on d5 here, because the knight takes d5, and this knight becomes an absolute monster in the middle of the board. Therefore, black goes queen c8. Also not the best move in this position, because after rook c1, there is certain tension on the c file. Rook d8, creating the same type of pin on the d file. Queen goes away to a4. Now white already want to take a pawn on c6. Therefore c5 is a good answer, creating some counterplay and defending the pawn on c5, because it's defended by 3 pieces. Rook d1, with some ideas for the future to play d6. C takes b4, and knight b5. So here you see, you can start feeling the pressure on the queen. And the problem is for black that the queen doesn't really have many moves here. So let's say if the queen goes to b8, for example, then knight e6 wins the game, because there is attack on the queen and attack on the rook at the same time. If the queen goes to d7, for example, then d6 is very strong, and bishop has to go away to f8, and white's position is just dominant. So therefore, the best move in this position was knight c5, counterattacking the white queen, and also protecting the queen on c8. Instead, probably under pressure, because the position was not really pleasant, black makes a mistake and plays bishop c5, putting the bishop next to the queen, and it's pinned. And it would be very difficult to unpin this bishop, I'm sorry. A takes b, and knight takes b4. That was probably the plan, because everything seems to be protected, at least for now. Also, black didn't lose a pawn. As a matter of fact, they won a pawn. They're up a pawn in this position, but again, white's position is so dominant that the pawn is not doesn't matter so much. Bishop h4, smart move, attacking um, the rook. And as in situation with the queen a couple of moves ago, the rook doesn't have many moves. Let's say it goes to e8, then knight d6 wins the exchange. And you cannot take the knight because there is a queen. The bishop is pinned, right? So the queen would be captured. So not so many moves by the rook. The rook goes to d7, one of the few moves can be made. And here is out of nowhere the hit on a7. And again, using the spin. Now you cannot take the knight with the bishop because the queen is under attack. And you cannot take the knight with the rook because queen takes a7. Again, using the pin. And white wins an exchange. In this particular position, it wins more because there is also almost a checkmate here. So after knight takes a7, black removes the queen from the attack, plays queen e8. White takes the bishop on c5 and has an extra piece, but immediately the black actually gets the piece back with the move knight a6, attacking the rook, and the knight on a7 becomes loose and not protected. So the rook is more important. The rook moves back to c1, and the black rook takes the knight on a7. So looking at this position, now the material is even. But again, every piece in white's position is in very good square. Queen is active, rook is active, the other rook is protecting the pawn on d5, very active. Knight on f4 is a monster knight, and bishop on h4 controls this diagonal. All the pieces in black position are either passive or completely out of play. The rook on a7 does nothing. It shouldn't be there really. Knight on the corner of the board is never a good thing. Bishop on f7, if you look, doesn't really have moves. So white plays d6, h6 with the threat of a fork. Therefore, bishop moves away to e7, suffocating black's position even more. b5 is an interesting move, kind of creating some counterplay, and actually it leads to black winning some material, but it doesn't help them. Queen takes d5. The idea here is that after rook takes e7, which is a nice tactical maneuver, you cannot take the rook with the pawn because the queen on the b5 is under attack. And so therefore queen takes e8 check, rook takes e8, and in this particular position black has an extra piece, but it doesn't help them. d7 and knight c7. Now d7, so the next move is queen. Rook d8 doesn't help because rook goes to c8, and after, let's say, rook a8, you take the rook takes, and still queen. So in this particular position, black played knight c7, queen on d8, check, knight goes to e8. Now in this position, white has an extra exchange, totally winning position. So the rest of the game, I'm gonna go quickly. And in this position, after g4, white resigned because black pawn structure is getting dismantled. Let's say something like this. This pawn will be lost. And with an extra exchange, a grandmaster easily wins this game. So very nice game by Alexei Serana, and he got 3.5 points out of 6, and he caught up with Fedoseev, who also has 3.5 out of 6. So let's take a look at the standings after 6 rounds. Nazarbek Abdusadorov, a grandmaster from Uzbekistan, whose game we saw against Gukesh, is leading with 4.5 points, together with Pragnananda Rameshmabu from India. He also has 4.5 points. Gukesh Damaraju, the world champion from India, has 4 points, and the rest of the group, a lot of three players have 3.5. Fabiano Caruana, the highest rated player of this tournament from USA, has only 3 points, so the tournament is not going so well for him, but a lot of games are still ahead, and we'll see what happens next. I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you for watching.